Thank you very much, Jasmine, and thank you very much to everybody who's joined today. I'm really pleased to be taking part in the UK Punjab Heritage Association's book club, and I'm very grateful to Amandeep for the invitation and to be part of South Asian Heritage Month. And I'm really grateful to all of you because I think for many of you, it's an act of trust, because I suspect not all that many of you have heard of the subject of my talk, Freda Bedi, and I hope that I can convince you over the next 45 minutes or so that she is a remarkable, intriguing figure and deserves the biography. I'm going to now share my screen so I can show you some images of Freda throughout her life. Here we go. Share, and now I need to get, I think we are there. There we are. I hope you can now see the PowerPoint display. If you can't, shout. But these are images of Freda Bedi at different times in her life. On the left, when she was a student and she was a communist, or at least close to communism, when she was a student at Oxford in the 1930s. In the middle, when she was living in Lahore in then undivided Punjab, that photograph of her taken probably in the early 1940s. And on the right, towards the end of her life, when she was not simply a Buddhist nun, but the most senior Tibetan Buddhist nun of her time. So a really fascinating and full and varied life, which is why I've called my book about her, The Lives of Freda. But if you haven't heard of Freda, I suspect you have heard of one of her children, Kabir Bedi, Bollywood heartthrob, author of recent memoirs. That's him with his wife Parveen in the middle. And I owe Kabir and his older brother Ranga Bedi a great debt of gratitude. The idea of writing a biography about his mother was mine, but I couldn't have done it without the support of the Bedi family, and particularly with the access they gave me to personal papers, diaries, correspondence, some voice recordings, a mine of information about their mother, which Kabir had kept because he has had the idea, and I think he still has the idea, that his mother's life deserves bringing to the screen in either TV drama or film fashion. And I hope, and I know he hopes, that will still happen. But if we start at the beginning, Freda Bedi was born Freda Hulston in Derby in 1911. Into a lower middle class family. On the left is her grandfather and her father as a child in her grandfather's shop door. Call it a shop. It was basically a house with the window of the parlor turned into a shop front. He was a watch repairer and jeweler. Her father, there he is on the right with his slightly grander shop. But they lived in a fairly working class area of central Derby in the English Midlands. And her father enrolled in the First World War. Indeed, he ended up in the Machine Gun Corps, which you perhaps wouldn't be surprised from the name of the corps, suffered a calamitous casualty rate during the First World War. And Freda's father died just a few months before the end of the war in 1918. So she had this real difficulty that she had vague vestigial memories of her father, but no clear memory of him. And that sense of an absent father was, I think, one of the things which shaped her life and pushed her particularly towards a sort of an almost mystical sense of faith, which came back to her much later on. Freda went to a modest fee-paying school in Derby. This is her when she was around about 18, and very much against the odds, and very unusually for the school she went to in Derby, she managed to get a place at Oxford University, deeply prestigious. There were very, very few places for women at that time to study French. And not only did she get a place, she got an exhibition, a minor scholarship, which provided her with the money which allowed her family to finance her to accept that place. She started doing French, but in fact, she moved on to do what was then called Modern Greats, which we would now call PPE. She didn't want to do French as a degree subject. She decided because the only thing you could do with French as a woman graduate was teach, and she didn't want to teach. What she wanted to do was to travel and to write, and she certainly managed that. She was a student at St Hugh's College in Oxford when there were just 5 colleges for women in Oxford, and women were outnumbered by almost 10 to 1 by male undergraduates. But she made firm friends with 2 other women at the college at the same time, who went on to be household names in the UK, who, like her, were not from a public school privileged background, but from a more modest background. And those friends were, top left, that's Barbara Betts. That was her maiden name, better known as by her married name as Barbara Castle, the commanding woman politician of her era, a left-wing figure in the Labour Party. The photograph below is actually Barbara and Freda in a punt in Oxford in the early 1930s. And Freda's other best friend is the woman on the right, Olive Shapley, not so well known now, but actually a communist, but more particularly a pioneer broadcaster and one of the people who established Women's Hour, which still is such an important part of BBC radio schedules. Olive was a rather bolder figure than Freda. Freda was, at this stage in her life, quite shy, quite retiring. She described going to Oxford as the opening of the gates of the world. Olive was a little bit more worldly wise, much more politically committed. Olive also, at Oxford, had an Indian boyfriend. This guy, Sajjad Zahir, also a communist, who went on to be one of the founding figures of India's Progressive Writers Association, a very prominent Urdu literary figure, and when he moved to Pakistan, a key figure in the Pakistan Communist Party, though in fact he moved from Pakistan back to Delhi not all that long after partition. Olive and Sajjad did not stay together, but perhaps slightly inspired by their example, Freda took up with an Indian boyfriend, a fellow PPE student, Baba Pyarelal Bedi, from Dera Baba Nanak in Punjab. He was a Sikh, a direct descendant of the first Sikh guru, as you see, not turbaned. He had studied at Government College in Lahore, come on to do a second undergraduate degree at Oxford, which was not that unusual at the time. He was distinctly athletic, very handsome, as you can see. Indeed, they are quite a striking couple. This is their engagement photograph. And they met not simply as fellow PPE students, but they also both attended meetings of the October Club, which was the Communist Students' Club. BPL Bedi became quite a determined communist during his time at Oxford in the early 1930s. And they also both attended weekly meetings of the Indian Majlis, which was the Indian students group in Oxford, where sympathizers who were not Indian were also very welcome, and which debated the issues of the day affecting India. And I think it's true to say that the awareness that Freda gained through those meetings of the oppressive police tactics used by the imperial authorities in India, the way in which the nationalist movement was suppressed, the way in which the Indian communist movement had been banned at that stage in the greater part of India, gave her a really tremendously strong anti-imperial sentiment. So she was involved in a whole range of activities, but she heard Tagore speak when she was at Oxford. She heard Gandhi speak when she was at Oxford. She heard Radhakrishnan lecture at Oxford. So she became immersed in Indian culture. Having an Indian boyfriend was quite a big thing. She believed she was the first Oxford woman undergraduate to marry an Indian fellow student. Her family took a little bit of coming round, though they certainly attended the wedding. Her college didn't like the idea. And indeed, Freda was disciplined for breaking the anti-chaperone rules. There were very strict regulations then about entertaining male students. You couldn't do it in your own room unless, one, you had a chaperone, and two, believe it or not, you had removed the bed from your room and put it in the corridor. And there were similarly restrictive rules about male students entertaining women in their rooms. And these were largely a dead letter, but nevertheless, because of, Freda believed, the transracial nature of this relationship, she was disciplined and humiliated, really. She was sent down from university 2 weeks early one term. But not only that, her grant awarding authority was told of this breach of rules. And indeed, this seems to have prompted some form of breakdown, which extended her university degree time by about a year. But it did not shake her commitment to marrying BPL Bedi. And indeed, she says that this sense of racial discrimination, and that's what she called it at the time, hardened the bond between them. But when they got married, it was front page news. Both the engagement and the wedding were front page news in the Oxford Mail, then a daily paper, and you can see the headline "Anglo-Indian Romance." The engagement photograph on the left, taken in Oxford Parks during winter, and then the wedding photo on a rainy day, but a summer's day in the summer of 1933. With Freda dressed in white, and you can see Baba Bedi with a pugri over his head. Freda recounted that the registrar at the ceremony showed his disapproval of marrying an English girl to an Indian man by refusing to shake the hands of the couple he had just married. Freda wrote rather powerfully about her romance with BPL Bedi. She said that they were, quote, two students in love, refusing to recognize the barriers of race and color, dissolving their religious differences into a belief in a common good, united in their love of justice and freedom. A marriage, she said, based on everything that was good in us. And it's certainly true that this was a real, genuine, warm romance. It's a really rather heartwarming story. And although Freda's college disapproved of the romance, they did have allies. One was the Professor Zimmern, Alfred Zimmern, the first professor of international relations in Oxford, and more particularly his French wife, Lucy Zimmern, who basically took the couple under her wing, and I think gave them the confidence to carry on with this relationship, and gave them the strength to resist all the slings and gossip and innuendo that headed in their direction. And it was also their friends. So Barbara Castle in particular really supported Freda's decision to marry her Indian boyfriend. She said, when Freda told Barbara that she was getting engaged, Barbara later commented that she said, "Thank God for that. I was worried you were going to be a boring suburban housewife." Well, Freda Bedi certainly was never a boring suburban housewife. While the couple were at Oxford, they were very active both in left-wing organizations and, as I said, in the Indian Majlis. This publication, Bharat, Inqilab Zindabad, we know what that means, was the publication of the Indian Majlis at that time, edited by Sajjad Zahir, a communist. And you can see from the cover design, the temper, the militant temper of that publication. And there were also slightly more temperate publications of the Indian diaspora in the UK. This United India, it says founded 1920-21, but this came out in the early 1930s. The contributors to this special number included quite a number of prominent people, including BPL Bedi and Freda Hulston, as well as her friend Olive Shapley. So this was a publication which brought together Indian nationalists, demanders of India's right to self-determination and those who supported the Indian national cause. A footnote to this, which I'm not well on, but if you've got any questions later, I can say more about it. Many years later, the authorities tried to work out, so who was active in the Students' Communist Group in Oxford in the early 1930s? They were very worried that some might have been sleeping agents of the Soviet Union, as some Cambridge communist students proved to be. And they got a very detailed list of all the communist students at that time from one of their number, Frank Strauss-Meyer, who was later an academic philosopher in the States, who wrote a long account of everybody he could remember from the Communist Club, including Freda and BPL. As soon as Freda married, even though it was another year before she set foot on in Indian soil for the first time, she decided that she would dress in the Indian style. So she wore salwar kameez, or on occasion saris. She wrote to her mother-in-law in Kapurthala in Punjab, saying that she'd found somebody who could tell her how to tie a sari, because, you know, these men, they're no good at telling you how to dress in the Indian style. By the time she had arrived with her husband in India, they had co-edited 4 volumes about contemporary India, 3 of them published by Victor Gollancz, the leading UK left-wing publisher of the mid-1930s. They'd also spent 9 months in Berlin. BPL Bedi got basically a research scholarship in Berlin, and off they went shortly after they married. And they only left when it became clear that as communists and as a mixed race marriage in Berlin, they were really in some peril. Though by the time they sailed for India, they already had a child. Ranga Bedi, who still lives in Bangalore, was their firstborn in Berlin in 1934. And they moved, well, they spent a little bit of time with the extended family in Kapurthala, where Kabir Bedi's mother had gone to live. His father was by then dead. His mother was a Hindu and had been part of one of the families in Kapurthala, which basically helped the princely ruler to run the state. But they made their home in Lahore. This photograph almost certainly taken in Model Town in Lahore in about 1934. So just a few months after Freda, this is her, had moved there. She is at this stage pregnant with their second child, a second son who sadly died in infancy. And it's a wonderful photograph in all sorts of reasons, and just the comfort with which Freda is dressed, and you know, what a gorgeous setting, you know. And this is Lahore in the mid-1930s. She said she reckoned at that time there were as many as 200 foreign white wives of Punjabis living in Lahore. Many of them who had met their husbands when their husbands were studying abroad, and there was quite a coterie of them. She made some very close friends among the other European and North American wives, but she also, more particularly, started working. She wrote as a freelance journalist. She got a job teaching English at a women's college, a nationalist-minded women's college in Lahore. And she also became a provincial organizer for the Punjab Civil Liberties Union, which was taking up the cases particularly of Punjabi peasants who suffered repressive policing at the behest, particularly of large landlords. But together, Freda and BPL also published in Lahore a really impressive political quarterly review. It was called Contemporary India. Each issue lasted for about 160 pages. They had a stellar list of contributors, including Subhash Chandra Bose, Netaji, the great radical figure within the Indian Congress Party. They had articles about contemporary politics. They published articles by Nehru. They published articles about people like Shaparji Saklatbala, the Parsi communist member of parliament in Britain. But they didn't just specialize in Indian politics. They had articles on international issues, Palestine, Burma, race in South Africa, and on culture, on gender, on marriage. They even published occasional pieces of poetry, a really impressive journal, which survived in Lahore for as long as 10 issues, about 2.5 years. It never made much money, but nevertheless, it was a really important venture, and it's rather been overlooked, I'm afraid. And after that collapsed, BPL and Freda worked together again on a much more popular paper called Monday Morning. It was a weekly. It was, in their words, a bit of a rag, very directly political, agitational. And because the mainstream daily papers did not publish on Monday, they gave the journalists a day off on Sunday, which was very generous of them. On Monday morning, the publication Monday Morning had the field larger to itself. And it's said to have sold as many as 40,000 copies. Though to my great frustration, I have not been able to find a single copy of that newspaper, even though it survived for 18 months and made quite a big impression. And this is Freda and BPL with their first child, Freda Bedi, very happy little kid. And as you can tell from that photograph, two very doting parents. The photograph in Model Town that I showed you was when Freda and BPL were staying at the home of BPL's older brother, who was in the Indian civil service and a magistrate and very establishment-minded. BPL and Freda were, of course, not establishment-minded. They were freedom fighters. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. They were nationalists. And they made the very bold decision not to live off family money, to move out of the family home. And initially they set themselves up in huts, I mean, literally huts, in Model Town on a vacant plot of land. And when the Model Town Society said, that's not what our plots are for, they moved a little further out and they set up a suite of huts, 3 huts, in mustard fields just outside Model Town. When I say huts, these were grass covered. They had no running water. They had no power. So when Freda had to mark her classes' essays or prepare, if she was doing it after dusk, she had to use a kerosene lamp. But they did have, I mean, when I say three huts, one hut was for Freda and Baba, one was for Baba's mother and for Ranga, their son, and one was for the domestic servants, and they kept buffalo, they kept quite a menagerie of animals, and they also did a little bit of their own vegetable plot, allotment style gardening. So they were partly self-sufficient. I mean, this is not quite a back to nature move, but it was a very clear and ostentatious rejection of the privilege to which BPL Bedi had been born. Freda seems to have been happy with it, though when Freda's mother came out to visit from Derby, she was, I think, a little less impressed. When the Second World War broke out, BPL Bedi, as a communist, the communists initially disapproved of the war effort, of India's co-option into the pro-British imperial war effort. Bedi and other communists tried to disrupt military recruitment, and they tried to disrupt the railways. Bedi was basically interned as a communist without any substantial trial for about 15 months. And even though her husband had been locked up in an internment camp in the middle of the Rajasthan desert in a place called Deoli, which was used a generation later to intern Chinese Indians during the Indo-Chinese War of the mid-60s, Freda decided early in 1941 that she would give herself up for arrest, would court arrest, as part of Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha protest. And Gandhi had to approve all those who wished to be satyagrahi, and he personally approved Freda Bedi's desire to court arrest. And she went to her husband's home village of Dera Baba Nanak, now just the Indian side of the partition line, and said that she was going to break the imperial war regulations. This was the standard way of doing it, and then was arrested by the police before she had a chance to make a public speech denouncing the war regulations. The British authorities, certainly in Punjab, had never come across a white woman courting arrest as part of Gandhi's protest. Freda at this stage, I think it's fair to say, was closer aligned to the Congress Party than she was to the Communist Party, though the division between the two was not as solid then as it later became. And in perplexed about what to do with a European woman courting arrest, and thinking that they couldn't really have a local police officer, male, arrest a white woman, they actually sent a white police sergeant from Amritsar to undertake the arrest. So Freda was arrested and she was given 6 months hard labor in Lahore female jail. She only served 3 months of that 6 months, but it was for her quite a turning point. There were both political prisoners and criminal prisoners in that jail. Freda was, in a sense, quite lucky because the hard labor she was given was actually supervising the work of the criminal prisoners in gardening in the grounds of the jail. And she got to know many of the criminal prisoners and wrote later about their individual stories. A lot of them were women who were alleged to have killed abusive husbands, or to have killed husbands who were pimping them. And she felt a great outpouring of sympathy for their stories. And she recited these stories in some detail and with great compassion in one of the books of articles that she published. And she continued writing as well, particularly for the Tribune, now published daily in Chandigarh, but then published from Lahore. And indeed, during the Second World War, after her release, she wrote a woman's weekly column for the Tribune called From a Woman's Window, a very early example of a woman journalist writing about women's issues for a male and female leadership in a mainstream daily newspaper, writing about issues such as caste, dowry, breastfeeding, women's dress, a range of issues which were not generally addressed at that stage in the mainstream press. She also, after her release, traveled for the Tribune and particularly reported from Bengal during the terrible Bengal famine of 1943-4, a famine which, if not caused by Churchill's wartime administration, was greatly intensified by that administration. And her journalism from there, mainly for the Tribune, was published subsequently in book form and as Bengal Lamenting. And you can see this hugely powerful cover image designed by Soba Singh, then a progressive artist who was later famous for his paintings of the Sikh gurus. And it made quite an impact. And she gave, she basically found a bike and cycled round villages in Bengal, what we now call West Bengal, and in Orissa, and gave accounts of what was happening in the villages rather than simply the towns, and particularly the impact of the famine on women and on children and on families who sold their daughters, and on the way on which people were preying, particularly on women and on women who felt that they had no alternative but to sell their bodies because their family simply had no food. There was food available, but the only food available was at prices that many ordinary people simply couldn't afford. And as you know, the Bengal famine was one of the most profound tragedies of the 1940s and accounted for anywhere between 2 million and 5 million deaths. It quite possibly accounted for more deaths than the violence that accompanied partition. During the latter part of the war, the Bedis also started going to Kashmir, a princely state, where they were allies of the leading radical Kashmiri nationalist politician, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, the commanding Kashmiri political figure of the last century. And indeed, BPL Bedi, Freda's husband, drafted the key 1944 manifesto of Sheikh Abdullah's movement. It was called New Kashmir. And it's remarkable in all sorts of ways. It's 44 pages. It is the most comprehensive radical manifesto produced in South Asia in that period. A lot of its proposals for a constitution for Kashmir were actually lifted from Stalin's constitution for the Soviet Union, which was promulgated in the late 1930s. But as well as that, the document had a peasants' charter, which called for far-reaching land redistribution, which was one thing that Sheikh Abdullah managed to achieve when he came to power. And there was also a women's charter, and this is almost unheard of in South Asia in the mid-1940s, which demanded the freedom of women to practice trades and professions, to marry and to divorce, and to have custody of their children, and for entry into colleges. At this time, there wasn't a single degree level college in Kashmir awarding degrees to women. And not only that, the iconography of the pamphlet, this is the original edition, is very striking. The flag showing a white plough and a red background is that of the National Conference, but you might be excused for imagining that it's very similar to that of the hammer and sickle and the Soviet Communist Party. And it features on its cover a politically assertive Kashmiri woman in 1944. And this photograph was taken at a National Conference annual gathering in Kashmir, in the Kashmir Valley in 1945. There's Freda on the far right, largely obscuring her husband who's standing behind her. Freda is clearly pregnant. Kabir Bedi was born in Lahore in January 1946. And in that photograph, there are 5 future prime ministers. You have Nehru with his Nehru cap a little bit left of center. You have his daughter Indira Gandhi, a little bit right of center. That's the frontier Gandhi from Peshawar in the middle. He is holding Rajiv Gandhi. And then also in the picture behind Indira Gandhi is Sheikh Abdullah, who became the prime minister, that was his official title, the prime minister of Jammu and Kashmir, the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and his successor, Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad, is standing behind Nehru. 5 prime ministers in one photograph, and Freda Bedi is there as well. What a marvelous photograph. And it just shows you how central she was. She knew Sheikh Abdullah extremely well. She was on good terms with Nehru. She was quite a close friend and indeed a confidant to Indira Gandhi. She was also, so after partition, the family couldn't really remain in Lahore. They moved to Srinagar, the Kashmiri capital, and lived there for 5 years, very politically active. And Freda Bedi enrolled in a militia, a left-wing women's militia. And here she is bearing a rifle. It's one of those rather hidden episodes in Kashmir's history, which I'm planning to write at more length about. But in late 1947, the communists formed a women's militia in Kashmir, which lasted for about 7 or 8 months. There's a men's militia which saw active service. The women's militia didn't see active service, but the women were trained in drilling, in how to use rifles, and in how to use grenades. And it was a left-wing militia, but it was in support of Sheikh Abdullah, and in part it was a self-defense force in case pro-Pakistan forces invaded Srinagar. For all sorts of reasons, it's been largely expunged from the historical record, but Freda Bedi was part of it, and these photographs demonstrate that. And in Freda Bedi's arms, in the photograph on the left, is Kabir Bedi. by the early 1950s, Freda's marriage to BPL was fracturing. They never divorced. They never formally separated, but they lived increasingly separate lives. BPL was, I think it would be fair to say, entitled in a masculine sense, which I think Freda found very hard. And she moved to Delhi, and to get work, she worked for a while with the United Nations in Burma. She then moved on to work as an Indian civil servant. Indira Gandhi got her a job as a journalist, publishing a really rather adventurous publication called Social Work, which was part of the Indian Planning Ministry. She also became a Buddhist. She discovered Buddhism in Burma on her first visit there, and it fitted a sort of spiritual quest which she'd explored a little bit when she was a Christian as a schoolgirl, but then had abandoned. And Buddhism very quickly became the most important part of her life. She went back to Burma for a second time in about 1955. There's a photograph of her on the left. The young boy on the left of that photograph is Freda Bedi, who for several months was a novitiate Buddhist monk in what was then Rangoon. And on the right, garland in the middle in 1956, is the Dalai Lama, then 21 years old, on his first visit to India, the visit from which he returned to Chinese-occupied Tibet. And on the right of the picture is Freda Bedi, who was given the job of accompanying the Dalai Lama round Buddhist holy places in and around Delhi. And that little girl just peeping out from Freda Bedi's sari is actually Freda's fourth child, her daughter Gulhima, who'd been born in Kashmir. Buddhism became so important to Freda that when Tibetan Buddhists followed the Dalai Lama on the hugely hazardous trek across the Himalayas in 1959, when the Tibetan rebellion against Chinese rule was crushed, she demanded of Nehru, going straight to the Prime Minister, that she be sent to the refugee camps that were springing up in Assam and in the north of West Bengal to take the Tibetan refugees. The Tibetan refugees had died in huge numbers crossing the Himalayas, partly because they were harried by the Chinese Red Army, more so because they starved to death and they died of exposure. When they reached the refugee camps in Assam and West Bengal, they died of something that they had never encountered before, malaria. They were also completely unused to the climate and to the cuisine. Freda Bedi said to Nehru, "Let me go out to these camps and try and make sure the facilities are up to what we need to provide for these very desperate and noble refugees." And that's her in 1960 in the camp at Misamari in Assam. And along with her are two of the Rinpoches, the most exalted Tibetan holy figures, who became, in her words, her adopted sons, Trungpa and Akong Rinpoche. And she decided that she would devote her life to helping these Tibetan refugees. She resigned from the Indian civil service. And she realized that there was one great gap in the provision that India was making for these refugees. They were providing basic facilities, but they were sending the refugees out to earn their living, often as road repair gangs, road laborers, basically. And the lamas and the incarnates among the Tibetan refugees were simply, first of all, they were not used to manual labor. And secondly, their spirituality and their exalted role within Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan social structure simply was not understood on the Indian side. She decided to work to make special provision for the Tibetan lamas, Rinpoches, and others who came over the mountains. And working with the Dalai Lama, she set up an organization called the Young Lamas Homeschool, initially in Green Park in Delhi, and then later in Dalhousie. And the idea behind this is that young incarnate lamas would come to the homeschool and would be taught partly about Tibetan spirituality, but would also be taught the skills they needed to adapt to what Freda, alas, rightly realized would be a very long time in exile away from Tibet. So she made sure that as well as learning the Tibetan language and Tibetan liturgy and Tibetan spiritual practice, that they were taught English and Hindi and history and geography, and were equipped for a life outside Tibet while retaining the spiritual traditions which were so important. And the more that she engaged with Tibetan Buddhism and with Tibetan Buddhists, the more that she was attracted to it herself. And indeed, she decided in the mid-1960s that she wished to be a Tibetan nun herself. Her guru was the 16th Karmapa Lama. This is a photograph taken of them at the order's headquarters in exile at Rumtek in Sikkim. The Karmapa Lama is the head of the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. And she took initially a novitiate ordination from the Karmapa Lama. She then, and she hadn't actually told her family that she was intending to take that, so they were slightly surprised to discover that she'd shaved her head and was wearing the robes of the novitiate nun. She set up a small Tibetan nunnery in Dalhousie because she realized that no provision of any sort was being made for the Tibetan nuns who were either based in India or who were among those who'd crossed the mountains in the wake of the flight of the Dalai Lama. And that nunnery, it's moved, but it moves to Tilakpur, but it still survived. And she was seen as a great champion of Tibetan women religious. But she also eventually took the higher ordination of a nun at a ceremony in Hong Kong organized by the Karmapa Lama. And it is at least possible that she was the first Tibetan woman nun to take this higher ordination. I'm not saying the first white Tibetan woman, but the first Tibetan woman of any background to take that higher ordination. And she did another really quite remarkable service for Tibetan Buddhism. She, I think, realized that for Tibetan Buddhism to be secure in exile, it had to reach out and find new adherents and make new alliances. And she realized that there was a real spiritual interest in Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in Europe and North America. And she persuaded the Karmapa Lama to undertake the first major rock star style trip to the West. So, and she accompanied the Karmapa Lama on what was a 5-month, I think it was a 6-nation tour around Europe and North America. They addressed dozens of gatherings, mainly of Westerners, not of Tibetans. They met the Pope. They met people like Yehudi Menuhin in the UK. And it helped in a very big way to get Tibetan Buddhism on the map. And it helped to build links with the emerging New Age spiritual movement in the United States in particular. And this was before the Dalai Lama had embarked on his international travels. So this was a really landmark moment. And I think in as much as Freda Bedi, she was known as Sister Palmo, that was her religious name, is remembered and revered now within Tibetan Buddhism. It is for encouraging Tibetan Buddhist leaders to reach out to new adherents in the West and it is in equipping the young lamas, some of whom are still very much at the helm of Tibetan Buddhism, to be intellectually and otherwise equipped to operate outside Tibetan soil. Freda also kept in touch with her family, sometimes a little bit bumpy. Her husband actually had his own spiritual enlightenment. He turned to a whole range of different beliefs, including the occult and Sikh mysticism, and moved to Italy, where he styled himself as Baba Bedi the 16th, because he was the 16th generation descendants of the first Sikh guru. And on the right, you have a picture of Baba and Freda with their three surviving children, Kabir, Guli, and Ranga. This rather wonderful photograph was taken by an American photographer of Freda while a nun towards the end of her life. I mean, what a picture of contentment and serenity. She died in 1977 of a heart ailment. She died actually during an international Buddhist gathering in Delhi. And at her cremation in Delhi, Buddhist adherents from many different countries were present and were chanting and praying, and her ashes were taken to Rumtek in Sikkim. And to this day, there are quite a number of senior Western Buddhists who regard Freda, Sister Palmo, as their guru, somebody who has entirely changed their lives. So it's quite a life: communism to nationalism, to being jailed by your mother country because you're supporting India's cause against Britain's, to a very exalted life as a Tibetan Buddhist nun. But that, I hope, has given you some idea of the scale and the breadth of Freda Bedi's life. You can see why I think why I've entitled my biography The Lives of Freda. And I'm very happy to respond to any comments or anything that you would like to say about her. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk on such a fascinating woman. When I thought I got to know a bit more about her, you kind of uncovered this whole new layer to her. So thank you so much for telling her story. I just want to say that we're going to open up to questions. So if you do have any questions, please just pop them in the Q&A bar at the bottom. You can also have the option to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you and you can ask your questions directly to Andrew as well. So please do that too. Firstly, I'd just like to ask my own question. I'm sure you get asked this a lot probably, but I just wanted to know a bit more about your personal connection with Freda, and how you sort of came across her story and what made you want to write your book about her.
So when I was with the BBC, I spent a total of 7 years living in India, living in Delhi, and Kashmir was the big story at that time. So I spent quite a lot of time reporting Kashmir. It's a very unhappy time, very violent time in Kashmir's history. But I also met some, what you might call old timers in Kashmir. And I've always been interested in history. I've got a PhD now in Kashmiri history. But some of these veterans of the Kashmiri nationalist movement, secular leftists, told me about this English woman who wore salwar kameez and spoke at least a bit of Urdu, and who was on their side, who was part of their movement. At that stage, a movement against the Maharaja. It was against princely rule rather than, India or Pakistan or anything like that. And it lodged in my head, and I thought, wow, that's quite a good story. And I actually wrote a book, an oral history about Kashmir in the late 1940s. And I was in touch with Kabir at that stage to see what he had to say about his mother and what archives he had. And it was a chance conversation with an Indian publisher. He said he was trying to, he wanted to publish a series of biographies of Indian lives, but challenging the conventional idea of what it is to be Indian, and did have any ideas about who could be included. And I said Freda Bedi because Freda took an Indian passport. She regarded herself as Indian. she worked for the Indian Civil Service. She was deeply annoyed and indeed hurt when her old friend Indira Gandhi gave her a special award as a foreign woman who'd been of service to India, because she said, you know, what do I have to be Indian? Look at what I'm wearing. Look at how I've lived my life. And I suppose as I got more interested in his story, I mean, I'm not going to overstress this, but there were parallels with my own. I'm from the north of England, as she was. Whether Derby's in the north of England, you can argue about, but it's getting that way. It's not quite Yorkshire, but it's almost honorary Yorkshire. I went to a grammar school, a bit like she did. I went to Oxford, a bit like she did. I was involved in left-wing politics as a student, as she was. I married into India, as she did. I, helped to raise a family in Delhi, as she did. I've been very involved in Kashmir one way or another, as she was. Now, there are lots of differences. I mean, generation, gender, and I'm not a Buddhist. And I found it quite a challenge to get into the mindset of moving from, being a sort of left-wing agnostic to being a Buddhist nun. But those similarities, I think, also drew me into her life story and encouraged me to try and find a way of making it resonate to an audience today.
Thank you, Andrew. And do you think there was a certain sort of facet of her life which drew your attention the most?
You know, when you see the photographs of her bearing a rifle in Kashmir in late 1947, it's not what you expect of somebody who went on, who's sort of British by birth. It's not what you expect of somebody who went on to be a Buddhist nun. And it tells you a story of the whole Kashmir dispute at that time, which is completely hidden because it just doesn't suit any of the competing narratives, Pakistani nationalist, Indian nationalist, or Kashmiri nationalist. So I found that very intriguing, but I also really was intrigued by what she did when she was a student at Oxford. I'm just understanding the way in which social lives of women students were restricted, but also the way in which she had found a real interest in what was happening in India and the way in which Indian students were engaging with that. And that was, I think, the big political turning point. She was never an ideologue. Her husband was an ideologue. He became a fairly convinced Marxist. Freda was just thought that imperialism was wrong. It was morally wrong. And her compass bearings in her political life and in her spiritual life were moral more than anything else.
Thank you. V. Walker asked, what do you think Freda would have made of the concept of being both and not half?
But being what, sorry?
Being both and not half.
Being both and not half. I'm not sure I understand that.
I think that means like of both Indian and then Indian,
I see.
not half.
I mean, I think she would say she just made a series of personal choices. The key one being the man she fell in love with. And I think in many ways she expanded women's room, and she was something of a proto-feminist. But having decided that she was marrying an Indian, she was quite clear. She was Indian, and she was going to make her life in India, even though she didn't know that country. But I think she felt that once she had made that decision, she couldn't be half and half. She was Indian, and there was no equivocation there. I mean, she still had family in the UK, and she still, on occasions, would trade a little bit on her privileged status and on her skin color. It helped to open doors. It got attention, but she was unequivocal. She's Indian.
Thank you. You mentioned that, she came from a working class background. She was born in Derby. Do you think had she not met BPL, what do you think she would have done? Would she have become a politician, a broadcaster?
I don't know. I think she would have aspired to write. I think she would have probably been a journalist. Not so much a news journalist, but a features journalist. I think she would have done well at it. It was simply a chance that she met an Indian fellow student. It's something of a coincidence, but it's a rather nice coincidence that actually Derby, where she had, when she was a child, no association with India directly of any sort, now has quite a sizable Punjabi and particularly Sikh community. And it has gurdwaras, it has a Sikh museum, and I mean, Freda is not a Punjabi in any conventional sense, but you know, that is a remarkable fact, and I very much hope that Freda's birthplace is still standing in central Derby, that one day there will be a blue plaque to her there, because she does represent something of a sort of prehistory of that link between Derby and the Punjab.
Yeah, and actually drawing on that, V also asked, is she remembered and commemorated in Derby in any other way? I know you mentioned about the blue plaque, but is there any other way that she is being commemorated? And if so, how?
No, I've had the privilege to give a couple of talks about her in Derby, and they've attracted interest. And in fact, I'm talking about her on Radio Derby tomorrow.
Oh, amazing.
But no, she's not remembered. And she never lived in Derby after she went to Oxford, you know, so that's what, 90 years ago almost. And her family, she's got no direct family in Derby. So I'm afraid the sort of popular memory of her has died out. But that doesn't mean to say it's not worth rekindling.
Definitely. I also just wanted to ask, obviously BPR was a descendant of Guru Nanak, and I wondered whether his sort of Sikh religion had any influence on her life, and in what way. And then also Chenab Mangat also asked whether she would have made any observations of the similarities between Sikhism and Buddhism.
It's a very good question. BPL Bedi, although he made a lot of his direct descendancy from the first Sikh Guru, was not observant, certainly during the period of their marriage. And I have not come across anywhere any reference that Freda has made to Sikhism. So, I mean, that's an absence there. And Freda actually did, before she converted to Buddhism, she did show an interest in Hinduism and in Islam. But I have to say, not in Sikhism. But BPL Bedi, after his own spiritual experience, which was after the marriage had started to break up, he did take a real interest in Sikh mysticism. And as I say, the name he took when he moved to Italy, became something of a mystic and guru, was Baba Bedi the 16th, and that was because, as I say, he was the 16th generation descendant of the first guru. I think it was also a little bit of a counter. It must also be in part a reference to Freda's guru, the 16th Karmapa Lama, almost as if there's a little bit of competition between the two.
Thank you. I also just wanted to ask, do you think Freda would have felt, you know, as she was married to an Indian man, do you think she would have felt more of an outsider in the UK or in India?
What a good question. I suspect that she probably felt more of an outsider when she came back to the UK. I mean, for a whole range of reasons. One is that she'd insisted on wearing salwar kameez. Even if she came back by herself, she would wear salwar kameez, or she would later wear her Tibetan robes. So she was marked out visually in that regard. And after she moved to Lahore in 1934, India, and I'm using India in the undivided sense initially, was her home. I mean, it was her home for the last 43 years of her life. So, you know, it was home for a very long time, home to her for much longer than the UK was, home for almost all of her adult life. She always spoke Hindi with a pronounced English accent, but she could manage in Hindi and in Urdu and Punjabi. She understood the culture. She didn't mind traveling third class in the trains. She was fine in India.
And drawing on from that, do you know what her relationship was like with her mother-in-law and, you know, her Indian side of the family?
So when Freda and Baba arrived in India first time, they sailed to Bombay with their firstborn child, Ranga, who was still in nappies. And they got the train up to Punjab and they traveled to Kabartala, where her mother-in-law was living. They had exchanged letters, but of course they had never met. And Freda was very nervous about meeting her mother-in-law for the first time. And she knew it was a really important relationship. And she walked into the room, and by her own description, the first thing she did is she was wearing a very soiled cotton sari. She'd been nursing her baby in the train. She was a bit of a mess. It was an overnight train journey, maybe even over 2 nights. And she went in and she touched her mother's feet. And that immediately, you know, it told everybody that she was there to fit in. She wanted to be part of the extended family. And the story is often told that she fitted in a little bit better than a sister-in-law who was from a much more elite background and was sort of more westernized and wore the latest styles, often dressed in Western style. So she made a real effort to fit in. And Babuji, as the mother-in-law was known, came to live with the extended family in those huts outside model town in Lahore. And it's quite something that she came to live with that branch of the family rather than with any other branch of the family. So I think the mother-in-law must also have felt comfortable.
Thank you. And although you said she did make a massive effort to fit in, do you think, Gurjeevan asked, do you think that she would have ever been sort of judged as a white woman in India, especially during her sort of activism?
Well, she was a white woman in India. And I'm sure some people, and particularly political opponents, tried to suggest split loyalties. Having said that, although she was almost unique, not quite unique, there were 1 or 2 other Western women who were prominent in the nationalist movement. Quite a few British communists, men British communists, came out to Punjab and to other parts of undivided India and were active in the left movement and indeed were involved in the Meerut conspiracy trial. So there was a tradition of people from the UK coming to be part of the Indian progressive and nationalist cause, even though, at first glance, you would have imagined that they were on the side of the imperial force. And I think, the fact that she chose to court arrest and spent time in Lahore female jail, I think was a very clear indication of whose side she was on. So there may have been some people who wanted to pull her down, but her record, her personal record, was such that it won her respect. And she was widely respected within the nationalist movement.
And do you know if Freda's involvement is acknowledged in current discourse around nationalism and around Kashmir and India generally? That was asked by Gurdas.
It's there, but it's not prominent. There was actually National Book Trust publication about Freda in Hindi, maybe 10, 15 years ago, but designed for a younger audience. And she is mentioned. But I suppose, I'm not pretending she was one of the key commanding figures. She wasn't. She wasn't a leader of Congress. She was never sought elected office. She was somebody who got things done. She was an activist. She traveled a lot. She rubbed shoulders. She was a great networker. She was a brilliant networker. Initially shy, by the time she was in Lahore, she just got on with people. She got on with people like not simply Nehru and Indira Gandhi, but Subhash Chandra Bose and quite a few other really quite commanding figures. But I think it's very difficult to go beyond that.
I'm just gonna go on to Satwinder Semi now. He has raised his hand, so just unmute you.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a fascinating talk. about a woman who was speaking about the unspeakable at the time. Couple of questions. Is there any chance of being able to get a copy or even a facsimile of a book lamenting Bengal?
She wrote 2 books, and they're both published during the Second World War, which meant that circulation was very limited because of wartime rationing and stuff like that. So they're not easy to get, and it has never been formally republished. You might be able to get a print-on-demand copy. They are sometimes available, though they're not very high quality.
It doesn't matter.
but you'll be able to get something.
Right.
But if you go to the ABE website, will have something. But print on demand from Indian specialist organizations are a bit hit and miss. Some are wonderful and some are slightly less wonderful.
And thank you for that. And the second question was, in your opinion, is there a lasting legacy of Freda's thinking that has been left?
I think there's more of a lasting legacy within Tibetan Buddhism. I think that's the place where she does have a legacy. As I say, there are still people who were taught by Freda at the Young Lamas Home School as youngsters who are now heading Tibetan study centers, monasteries, certainly in the UK, in North America and elsewhere. And she was part of that movement which helped to win a Western audience for Tibetan Buddhism. Zen Buddhism had an influence a little bit earlier, but Tibetan Buddhism sort of burst onto the scene in the early 1970s. And she met people like Allen Ginsberg, for example, the American beat poet who had an interest in Buddhism. So that is, I think, a legacy. I think it's difficult to discern a direct legacy in terms of Indian nationalism. In Kashmir, I think the secular, progressive strand of politics which she represented has now been almost squeezed out of existence, which I feel. I mean, I'm a journalist.
It's a tragedy,
but nevertheless, I feel sad about.
Yeah, and also I've just put a little tweet out. I did some pieces of work a few years ago where I wrote the symbol of the religion in the language of the religion with the word dharma in it. And I did one for Buddhism as well. I did 4. I just put them out. And thank you for reminding me that those pieces existed and it'd be nice to share them. And your talk was absolutely enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you, St. Linda. Thank you.
Thank you. There we go. I also just wanted to ask another question from the Q&A. What do you think would have prompted Freda's transition from political engagement to Buddhism?
I think it was a whole range of things. I think partly she became a little bit disillusioned by both communism and about progressive nationalism. I mean, it's partition soured the dreams of many nationalists. It was such a bloody rupture. So I think that was part of it. I think in Kashmir, where she lived for 5 years, she felt that there was a new world being created, but it didn't quite work out that way. Sheikh Abdullah turned out to be a little bit more flawed than she imagined. Then there was a big bust up between Sheikh Abdullah and Nehru, and Sheikh Abdullah was basically chucked out and jailed. So that dream turned sour. I think she was looking for another belief system. I think the breakup with her husband was also a really big blow, and I think that rocked her a lot. So she was looking for something. There was a void in her life, and she was. I think she was looking to fill it to some extent.
Thank you. Kulvinder Singh asked, what do you think the relationship would have been like between BPL and also Freda with their children?
Well, I've got to know Kabir and his older brother Ranga really rather well. And I've also met Guli, the daughter, who's now in the States. They're all very proud of both their parents. And their parents really, in many ways, quite different. I mean, the relationship was rather magical, and for 20 years or so it worked, but they were very different people. I think there was a real point of tension when Freda decided that she was basically renouncing a conventional life and becoming a nun. Her daughter was still in her teens. Kabir was in his early 20s, and actually he'd had quite a difficult time as a student. He broke his back at one stage and was spent a long time regaining his full mobility and his strength. And because she didn't take them into confidence, they felt a little bit betrayed by that decision, and it took quite some time to build that link again. But even though she was a nun, she was always there for her kids. So, I mean, just a small example, she traveled a lot towards the end of her life as a Tibetan woman religious. She traveled to South Africa, she traveled to the Far East, she traveled across Europe, she made 2 journeys to North America. And she would, the letters back, she would say things like, I've got some nice Marks and Spencer underwear for the grandkids. And I've just been to a record shop, and there's a new record out by Van Morrison, which is talked of very highly, and I'm bringing that back for Kabir because I think you might like it, Kabir. So she always had that attention. She was very determined to be there for her children. I mean, it's no secret that Kabir had quite a turbulent love life, and she was always there to try and give him some emotional support and anchor. Gulhima, her daughter, also had some difficulties, and she wanted to be there. She was present when Gulhima gave birth, for example. So she tried to balance her commitments to her religion and to the 16th Karmapa and to the Kagyu order of Tibetan Buddhism with an obligation to her family.
Thank you. Sadia asked, was she the first prominent English woman to have assumed Indian citizenship? Do you know?
Ooh, she certainly wasn't the first British person. So people like JBS Haldane did so. I don't know is the answer. It's a rather good question. I suspect not. I think there would have been a number of people who were in mixed marriages. I mean, racially mixed marriages were nothing like as rare at that time as you might imagine them to be. But I think there would be a number who would have opted for Indian citizenship. At first, what passport you had didn't really matter. And certainly when Freda travelled back to the UK, I think for the first time after independence, I think she travelled on her old British passport issued in Lahore, I think. But next time she travelled, she decided she would take an Indian passport. And she was quite clear if she had to actively make a choice, she was Indian. And there was no two ways about that.
Thank you. And another question was, what will her view have been of the partition?
It's surprising that she never, in anything that I've read of hers, passed a direct judgment on partition. BPL Bedi, actually, Freda was in Britain at the time of partition. She'd come back to show Kabir off to her family. She wasn't expecting partition when it happened. Who was? BPL was in Lahore and tried, and with some success, to rescue people who were at risk in Lahore. In that case, non-Muslims. He also helped a Muslim family in Missouri. I think she'd have been deeply saddened by it. I didn't think she saw this as what she expected to accompany independence. It wasn't the national dream that she had dreamt. It wasn't the national dream that BPL Bedi had dreamt. I don't think that's making a judgment on the rightness or the wrongness of Pakistan's case, but I think she felt that the fracturing was sad, and certainly she never visited Pakistan. BPL Bedi, I think, did once, but she left behind in Lahore many good friends who she never saw again after after 1947. And I think that was, a sadness on both sides.
Thank you. For those of you who joined us last week, we had sort of a similar theme where Philip de Slip joined us and spoke about sort of the little known history of Bhagat Singh Thind. So I'm actually going to steal Amardeep's question from last week and direct it at you, Andrew. What do you think Freda would have been like if you were to sort of just walk into a room and meet her?
I've thought about this a lot. As a biography, you really got to get under the skin of somebody. I think she would have been, she was a center of attention. Certainly towards the end of her life, she was deeply charismatic. She had, as you can see in some of those photographs, striking blue eyes. She had a soft voice. When I listened to the tapes of her, one of the things I was very curious about is whether she had a Derby regional accent. She didn't. She had a very upper crust Oxford accent. It was quite common in those days for people. I mean, Joan Bakewell did it. Barbara Castle didn't, but she had a political reason not to. You go to Oxford, you make sure you leave Oxford with an Oxford accent, not a Northern accent. There was something slightly imperious about her. She believed she knew best. She was quite certain in her beliefs. She was a great organizer, but her attention moved rapidly from one thing to another. But I think she was very kind, and she listened to people. And I think that's something that's really not always the case with people who develop a particular authority and standing and reputation. But she did listen to people, and she took very great deal of care in trying to help people. She was a helper. She wanted to hear people's stories, and she believed that she had a duty to respond more to the non-privileged than to the privileged. The privileged can look after themselves. It's those who don't have access to power that need help and support and need somebody echoing their voice.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that's a really great way to sort of draw the talk to a close. I just want to thank you so much again for such a fascinating talk. And just another reminder that you can purchase Andrew's book over Amazon. There should have been a link in the chat bar below.
So I should say that somebody's pointed out that it's out of stock on Amazon, which is
is
both good and bad news, but it is available there on Kindle. I hope Amazon will get it back on stock, and it's been published in India by Speaking Tiger, and it is available from Speaking Tiger, and I've had success in ordering it direct from the publishers, where it's even cheaper than it is on Amazon. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Jasmine.
There you go. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week at our next talk, Monday, 5 p.m. Thank you, Andrew, and I'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.